Kristina Wilson is professor of art history at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. She is an award-winning author and curator who writes about design history, the history of museums, and American modernism. Her book, Mid-Century Modernism and the American Body, Race, Gender, and the Politics of Power in Design, was published by Princeton University Press in 2021. She is currently co-editing an anthology titled Race and Design History. Her scholarship has been supported with grants from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Terra Foundation for American Art, and the Graham Foundation, among others. And with that, please enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, George, for that nice introduction, and thank you to Carol for inviting me to be a part of. I volunteered a little bit of my expertise supporting the development of this terrific exhibit that is here at the History Center, and I hope you all have had a chance to go in and see it before the talk, and if not, that you'll go see it afterwards. So I wanted to, I wanted to talk this evening highlighting some sort of key issues and questions that I took up and reflected on and thought about in my recent book that George was talking about, Mid-Century Modernism and the American Body. And so the book came out in 2021. I had actually been working on it for about 10 years, which is the way academia rolls, very slowly. So I've been living with this work for a long time. Anyway, so I'm showing you here four of the four major chapters, kind of their openings. One of the things I like to do when I'm thinking about writing a book is like, what's the image that wants to kind of set up the key questions for the chapter? So anyway, so here are four of the chapters, and tonight I'm going to sort of talk a little bit. I'm going to talk mostly about chapter 3 and chapter 2, a little bit of chapter 1. I'm not going to get into chapter 4 because then we'd be here all night. Anyway, so but as I begin, I always think it's helpful to situate what I'm doing as an academic or how I think about things intellectually. So I think of myself as a design historian. So what does that mean? So one of the things that I try to do when I'm asking questions about the objects that surround us in our everyday working spaces, living spaces, domestic spaces, I'm trying to think about these objects that we fill our lives with, how they can be tools for self-fashioning, for self-presentation. You know, we choose the things to live with very much the same way we choose clothing, you know, to say something about us to the people who are going to come into our spaces. So self-fashioning, self-presentation is key. And related to that, I'm very interested in how design can be understood as a tool of power. So, you know, because design is not actually something we wear, it's something we use. So whose bodies are allowed to be comfortable when you sit in a chair? Whose bodies are put on display, whose bodies are undervalued or disappeared, perhaps made to disappear or not represented in objects. So I started thinking about how design sets up power dynamics. And, you know, if you're wondering, I don't even know what that means, think about, like, let's say you have a living room space. Let's say you have a hierarchy of chairs in that space. There's a chair that you always want to sit in. And then there's a chair that, I don't know, your kid is allowed to sit in, or that the guest sits in, but nobody sits in your chair. You know, like, so there are hierarchies of power in how we use objects to sort of demonstrate who owns a space, and also, you know, who's sitting at the head of the table, who's sitting at the side of the table. You know, these are all structures of power. So, when I began working on this object about mid-century modernism, I began to think about how these objects from the mid-century that we are all, some of us might be familiar with, and you're going to see some familiar things. I began thinking about how they actually are involved in discourses of power. And in particular, its power around gender and its power around race. So here is an image that I'm putting up as kind of, this is like the glossy story of the mid-century. So the standard story of mid-century modernist design, these modernist design objects, is that it's finally the moment when, you know, we have this sort of spill out of suburbs, and suddenly everybody in the suburbs embraces modernism. Suddenly everybody wants modernism. And so you've got things like this Better Homes and Gardens page from 1955, where there are some bona fide modernist, really well-known modernist chairs appearing in this standard family home. So the dining chair with metal legs by Charles and Ray Eames, and I'm showing you a photo of it here, but you can also see it in real life back in there in the gallery. But also, this little girl here is sitting in a, she might not be sitting in an actual butterfly chair. Those were notoriously knocked off by lots of different sort of fly-by-night companies. But anyway, she's sitting in a knockoff or an actual butterfly chair. So these are well-known objects that suddenly appear everywhere. So the glossy story is that, wow, suddenly everybody is embracing modern design, and that's such a great thing. So I started wondering if this glossy story is really so easy and so sort of palatable. And I think the truth is it actually sort of hides some messy realities. The show here at the History Center takes us into some more complex and sometimes messy realities of the domestic spaces, the spaces of the home of the 1950s. And tonight what I want to do is just think about some of the messy realities that these actual objects set up specifically. So when we're thinking about design and design history, the glossy story says a couple of things. It says, first of all, affordability. That's the thing that's most important. So these objects were great and they were successful because they were affordable. As if affordability is important, yes, but is that the only thing that drives someone to choose to buy an object for their home? Perhaps you have at times bought an object that's a little more expensive than you could afford, but you're investing in it. You know, it's a sofa that you're going to have for the next 30 years. So you're willing to buy something a little more expensive. So affordability is not the only thing that's important in design. But this story of why these designs are important is always about how affordable they are. Another thing that this story always emphasizes is the use of new materials. It's so great that they're, you know, using sort of bent metal and suspended fabric or bent plywood. It's so cool that they're using all these new materials, and they look so interesting. And nobody's thinking about actually how comfortable or not these objects are. So the history is like, great new materials, great cool forms, and nobody's saying, are these actually comfortable for the body that's going to sit in them? And if any of you have sat in the Eames chair, you will agree with me, it's not exactly comfortable. And if you don't believe me, well, maybe you can get permission to go try sitting in the chair in there. But it's a very specific kind of chair, and it's not comfortable for everybody. The butterfly chair, well, I just want to, I don't know, does this girl look happy? Like she looks kind of like she's sort of like digging her way out of sort of the bucket of the seat. And I would actually just go back to my cover where this model, she's actually standing in the frame of a butterfly chair. And she's clearly decided perhaps it's so uncomfortable that she's just going to disassemble it and walk right through it. So anyway, so this is a design. So this is a history that doesn't take into account how comfortable these objects are. It doesn't take into account the fact that people might choose a price point that's not always about the sort of lowest price point. This conventional design history is a history that puts at its center the designers who had industry networks, the ones who could connect to mass manufactured, sort of larger scale mass manufacturing companies. And the ones who had these industry networks at the time in the sort of 1940s and then in the early 1950s, at the time, the designers who had these industry networks were predominantly, although not exclusively, white men. So when I began to kind of take apart or sort of to ask if this history, this glossy history, really, what does it have to say underneath it? What I started to think about was the fact that this is actually a story that is about white designers. Perhaps it's about white ideas about design, and it's about this sort of the use of design in a white framework, a racially white framework. And I kind of wanted to examine that a little bit further. One of the things I thought about is that mid-century modernist design might be actually involved in racialized whiteness. It might be, I don't know, it might be. And I perhaps have not noticed that because I myself am white. So I started with that question. Is this, could we understand these designs through this framework? What would it mean to do that? And the book is really kind of about the sort of different ways that I ask these questions. So for example, one of the things I do in the book is I look at how modern design was marketed to audiences. So not just the objects, but how it's marketed to audiences. And right after World War II. And so I'm thinking about marketing, and I'm also thinking about the designers and how the designers, what they say about how they talk about their designs. So these are from chapter 3. These are images from chapter 3. And chapter 3 is actually the first book, it was the first chapter I worked on. So that's why I thought I'd start us off this evening talking about it. So I did a lot of research on the Herman Miller Furniture Company, which is based in Zeeland, Michigan. Perhaps you're familiar with it. And they were responsible for a lot of the most famous designs from this period, like the Eames chair that we were just looking at. They were the manufacturers for it. And the director of design at Herman Miller was a designer named George Nelson. And George Nelson was responsible for designs. So he designed this modular system of storage system that we're seeing in the left and then middle images there. So he designed the sort of objects for Herman Miller, but he was also designing their advertising. He was designing their showrooms, and he was designing their product catalogs. And so the two photos, again, of the comprehensive storage system, those are photos taken from a Herman Miller catalog, and the one in the middle is actually a photo of a showroom. So we're seeing examples of how he's staging things for the catalog and the showroom. And then he was responsible for this advertisement, which appeared in the New Yorker in 1956. And so we're seeing examples of sort of how he's promoting the company. So one of the things I was interested to note is that Nelson repeatedly, one of the things he does is he sets up this kind of balance in his in this promotional material between the stuff that's for sale and the stuff that's not for sale. He's always staging his photos in the showrooms with these selected curios, these selected ethnographic objects. Or as you can see in the advertisement, he's got a mask in the upper left-hand corner of the ad. He's using these objects that are from non-Western cultures. They're very frequently tourist objects, but he's basically collecting them and then putting them on display. They are not for sale, but he's putting them on display in his showrooms and in the catalog and in the advertisement. And so what is it doing there? So one of the things I think it's doing is it's setting up this binary relationship between the objects that are not for sale and the modernist designs that are for sale. And so we've got handcrafted things, machine-made things. We've got things that show the human body versus abstract forms. We've got natural materials versus industrial materials. We've got some mythic primitive idea of some primitive maker, and I'm using quotes here because this is all horribly stereotypically generalized and inaccurate. But you know, these makers who do things with their hands versus George Nelson, who is this sort of rational designer, and the racialized connotations to these two sides of the binary become objects that represent people of color versus modern design represents whiteness. And so this binary sort of appears throughout the publicity material. So that's one thing I noticed about George Nelson's work. George Nelson was also designed chairs. And another thing I noticed is that his chairs are not actually very comfortable to sit on. And I don't know, have any of you had the good fortune to sit in any of these? So the coconut chair, it's okay to sit in, but like there's no arms. So you have to sit down and back, and then, I mean, so as long as you're doing your yoga or your Pilates or whatever, you know, you're good. Also, it only has 3 legs. So anyway, it's a chair that kind of asks a lot of questions and looks good, but is perhaps a little less comfortable and easy to navigate than you would expect. And actually, Nelson said this. What he said is, this chair needs practice and agility to sit in comfortably. We continue, however, to admire its elegance while making no mention of the fact that to enjoy the view, one naturally sits in something more comfortable. So that's what Nelson had to say about his own design. Another chair that he designed, or sofa that he designed that is not terribly comfortable, is the marshmallow sofa. So those sofa cushions are about 10 inches in diameter. So if you just think about like sitting on one, like you can't ever sit on just one. You're always like straddling 2. And actually that insight is thanks to the archivist at Herman Miller, who pointed that out to me. Also, if you sit like on the corner, sort of like right here-ish, and you're not careful, the whole thing can flip over on you. And yeah. So anyway, so this is another uncomfortable object. And as I was thinking about uncomfortable chairs and George Nelson, then I started thinking about, yeah, you know, you always see women on these chairs. And so here are 2 publicity photos made by George Nelson's office for the marshmallow sofa. And so in both of these, the women are trapped behind a grid of dots. Their bodies are kind of tantalizingly half hidden. And I would argue that these images are appealing because they are all about the glimpses that were given of each woman's body and the expectation that our gaze desires to see more. The thing that I think is interesting, I don't know about you, I'm just going to suggest, could we all agree that actually this photo is less successful than that one? Even though there's even a rose on the floor here, but there's just something that doesn't quite work about that one. I came across that photo in George Nelson's archive in Germany in 2013, and I'd never seen it before. Whereas the one with Hilda Longanati, and we even know her name because that's the photo you always see. She actually worked for Herman Miller. She was not a professional model. She ran sort of the front reception desk for the office. That is the photo you always see. So I don't know, what's so effective about it? What does it say about the design? This is a photo that does a lot with our imagination. We see her bare wrists, her bare ankles, even the drape of her skirt kind of falling away. It's sort of like it's a bubble sofa that becomes a bubble bath with a woman in it. And she's wearing this striped dress and her curls are so beautifully sculpted. She becomes this geometric tease that is sort of a part of the geometries of the sofa, turning the sofa's geometries into a tease. Now, it's not just that we frequently see women in modernist chairs in this period, we even see them nude in chairs. And this is a photo, a fabulous photograph that accompanied an article by George Nelson. This is the article where he said, "Oh, this chair requires agility to sit in." So this was the photo that basically accompanied the article where he's claiming that his own chair is not very comfortable. So yes, so we've got nude women in chairs. This woman is actually in Saarinen wound chair. And in fact, Nelson wrote a book about chairs in 1953. And he said, well, I'll show you what he said and how he illustrated it. So what he said about chairs is that now you've got this, mid-century houses are now beginning to have these open floor plans, ranch style houses, which we talk about, Carol talks about in the exhibit. And when you've got an open floor plan, suddenly a chair stands out because, it doesn't go against the wall anymore. So he says when the walls disappear, so he's talking about open floor plan houses, the only place left for furniture is out in the open. Hence, silhouette becomes important, and the most traditional designs for seating become unusable. And just to pause here for a second, when I came across this book, I was like, oh yeah, that's the quote that everybody says. Everyone says, that top part. So I was like, oh yeah, there it is. And then I kept reading and I was astounded at what I discovered next, because what it says next is, in this landscape, the chair remains as one of the unassimilable objects, and in consequence, it becomes very conspicuous. It becomes as much a piece of sculpture as an object of utility. One might now compare it to a girl in a bikini suit, who has to pay more attention to her figure than the ladies in the bathing costume, blah, 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 blah. So he is actually comparing chairs to women in bikinis. And the central opening image of the book, the frontispiece of the book, is that photograph. And, this photograph is, it's worth looking at. How does the woman's body mimic the chair? Her body has become this abstract form, and the curve of her shoulder and waist echoes the curves of the shoulder and back of the chair. Her crossed legs reference the twists of the legs of the chair, and the pads of her feet even look like the feet of the chair. One thing that this little analysis does is it points out to you how we anthropomorphize our objects. They've got backs, they've got shoulders, they've got legs, they've got feet. So what do we take away from all of this? So one of the ideas I explored in this chapter is that George Nelson's chair designs reveal an attitude towards power that is highly gendered. These chairs were about diva-like display, about putting women on view for men to gaze at. And to the extent that his designs also seem to be about defining cultural whiteness against the culturally exotic, then we might say that these designs participated in a rhetoric of controlling women, white women specifically. And so this is the Nelson ad that we've already seen that he created for Herman Miller, and there's actually a wonderful passage that I'm going to just highlight for you here about this chaise. And I'm looking at this text right here, and I'll read it for you. He says, and this is so Nelson, you can totally tell that he wrote this. Probably the most spectacular piece in the Herman Miller line, expensive too, is the chaise. properly filled, and he goes on to compare it to continental, yeah. Properly filled, we are referring to you, madam. It is guaranteed to put a new glint into the most tired husband's eye. Yeah. So, okay, so that's George Nelson, and I actually wrote about Nelson as an author in chapter 1 as well. And what I did in chapter 1 is I looked at 5 different advice books about interior decorating and design that were published between 1945 and 1951. And these are basically books that were written kind of like, you know, the war finishes up and everybody's like, we can tell there's going to be this housing boom. So let's step into the fray. Let's sort of offer advice about how people should build their houses, furnish their houses, etc. And so what I was thinking about here is like, what are modernists actually saying about modernism, about house design, about living in houses? And so I was looking at designers and architects. And so, first of all, there's a lot of judgment in all of these texts. And I'm going to be very brief on this chapter just because there's a lot of text, and to present it, I'd have to be reading a ton to you. But a couple of interesting themes emerge. So first of all of the authors describe the house as a place that governs the body, and especially like that, you know, you're supposed to do certain things in certain spaces. And especially, they talk about the house as a site of labor for the woman. And all of these are presuming a heteronormative household where the woman is in the kitchen and she's the one who's sort of, you know, running the house. In this group of authors, there were several white authors and then one African-American writer. Who was an architect. So the white authors in this group were Mary and Russell Wright, and they're represented by these 2 images here. And then there was a single woman, Mary Brandt, and she has these very charming illustrations here that was represented her book. And then George Nelson partnered with Henry Wright, another architect. And these 2 photos are from their book. And then the final author is Paul Williams. And he's represented, and he was the first Black architect admitted to the American Institute of Architects. His architecture practice was based in Los Angeles. And so he is the 2 images to the far right and left with the greenish wash to their page. So one of the things I noticed, so I was thinking about how do all of these authors talk about modernism? And one of the things that I noticed is that the white authors regularly describe modernism as a style that is going to distinguish their reader. It's a style that demands special commitment on the part of the reader. Like, you got to be ready to do it, willing to do it. You've got to work hard to do it, but it's worth it. That's what modernism is. Williams is different. He is alone among this group in suggesting that modernism was one style that you could choose among many styles. And he also sort of presents it like modernism is perhaps a style that's going to appeal to a lot of people, but there are a lot of styles that appeal to a lot of people. That's kind of how he writes. And so what struck me as interesting is that his rhetoric was much more one of inclusivity, presenting that modernism could be inclusive, as opposed to creating divisions, which was what the white authors are constantly doing with modernism. They're saying you have to prove yourself to be a modernist, you've got to make it to be a modernist. Modernism to them is always about this division and distinction, and it does not function that way for Williams. If the white authors are saying that modernism is a bar you have to meet, and it's sort of like, it's an approach to setting up your house that requires this constant vigilance. It really stresses you out to read these books, I have to say. You know, it sort of sets you apart from others. And in contrast, throughout Williams's text, he actually wrote two books, one in 45 and one in 46. And those are from each of these, those are what the images are on the screen. What you encounter as a reader is language that is all about modernism and modern interior design as tools of freedom. So how to design your home and its spaces to maximize freedom of movement, how to create a backyard space that is connected with the interior, like the living room, and just sort of opens out to your backyard space, and how all of that space becomes space of freedom. So he uses like terms like, this is a rambling space, and this is a space of openness and expanse. So these are all sort of terms that are sort of connote this sense of freedom and sort of freedom for the family and openness of movement. So one of the interesting things I found in this, when I was working on this chapter, is that Williams had a slightly but demonstrably different idea about modernism than his white architect and design counterparts. And it's not to say that, you know, he doesn't also say some similar things, but his emphasis is always on freedom and inclusivity, whereas the idea that they're setting up about sort of like, you've got to prove yourself to be a modernist really does not play any part in his text. So there are some really sort of meaningful differences in tone between these. So Williams is only one voice, and you can't really sort of, I mean, you can talk about what he means, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything bigger. But one of the things I started thinking about in my book is that I think that his attitude about modernism is connected to a larger counter-narrative about modernism in the mid-century United States. And it's a counter-narrative that's anchored around Black voices and Black lives that presents a set of values constellated around modernism that's different from how white designers, white architects, and advertisers value modernism in these years. And so I traced this counter-narrative further in chapter 2. And what I'm doing in chapter 2 is comparing how modernism appears in both Ebony magazine and Life magazine. And what I found is it's not that like modernism is super different between one and the other, but rather it just modernism, there are points of emphasis about what modernism means in Life and points of emphasis about what modernism means in Ebony that seem to be meaningfully different. So let me start with some points, some discussion about Life magazine. And I would say for both of these magazines that I'm going to talk about, one of the things I thought about was embracing the entirety of the experience of the magazine, the editorial images, the fashion images, the advertising, really sort of having it all be of a piece. And sure, advertising images are sometimes, you know, they are different than editorial images, but honestly, when you're reading a magazine, sometimes you're not paying attention to whether or not you're reading an article versus an ad, which is very much like how we consume social media, right? You're sort of like, oh, that's cool. Oh, no, that's an ad. And that's not, my friend didn't post that. That's an ad. You know, so we experience these magazines in kind of a fluid way. So in Life magazine, modern designs are very often connected to women. And here are just a few examples. So what we're looking at are this variety of editorial content. We're looking at fashion spreads that use modern furniture as props. That is the lower two images. The upper middle image is actually from a profile article. The one on the far right is actually an article about modern design, because this is about a Noguchi stool, and she's demonstrating the stool. But modern design also connects with women in the realm of advertising. And so the ad for Nemo girdles, which you're seeing on the far left, I found this to be an especially powerful image. And it's not just because the woman is partially undressed, like we've seen many examples of already. It's clear that we are meant to associate the pleasing curves of her encased body with the pleasing silhouette of Eros Saarinen's Model 72 chair, which is what she's sitting on. So the girdle and the chair perhaps does more than make her beautiful. As the ad copy explains, it curbs your curves with tender firmness. So this is a girdle and a chair to help keep you in your place, both physically and in the patriarchal order. So Saarinen's chair was manufactured by Knoll, which many of you might be aware of, and Knoll was like the major competitor to Herman Miller, and now they're merged. Now they're Miller-Knoll. But for years, they were the two sort of major producers of modern furniture in the United States. So we're seeing the same themes of control in women's bodies that we've already explored, and we're seeing them percolate to the surface. And I would propose that it actually appears in all of these images. These modern chairs keep white women on view and yet in their place. When they have their feet on the ground, they seem trapped, and more often than not, they can't get both of their feet on the ground. They can't actually get a purchase on the surface that would allow them to stand up and walk away. So the designs are somehow invested in exerting control over these women. Now, interestingly, when you take a broad view of modern design and life magazine over this decade of the 50s, one of the places it appears most frequently is in advertising for cleaning products, floor waxes, vacuum cleaners, rug shampoos, as well as products that would make your home seem clean at a foundational level, like paint or wall-to-wall floor treatments. So modern design, so you might be saying to yourself, okay, sure, fine, but modern design is actually a clever choice for advertisements for cleaning products because they're simple furniture forms and they're often elevated on slender legs. And so that helpfully shows us all that the floor is clean. So no duh, of course you would use modernism in an ad for cleaning supplies. But you see it over and over and over again. And I feel like the dominant presence in cleaning ads of modernism suggests a deeper logic. And I just want to sort of put out there, people often talk about modern design being very clean. Like, how often do you say, oh, the clean lines, or oh, that design is, clean lines? And I want to say that in the 1950s in Life magazine, modernism was the prop of cleanliness. And it's the modern design's vigilant stance against dirt in the advertising realm is an example of modernism as this extreme agent of control. And it's also operating, I think, as a form of exclusion. The protagonists in these advertisements are invariably white women. The modern designs in their clean homes in racially segregated suburbs become props to reinforce their whiteness and to insist on racial exclusion. So let me just show you a couple of these in a little more detail. So here is this ad from a 1953 Life for GE vacuum cleaners. So the housewife is extending the cleaner throughout the entirety of her modernist living room. So the nozzle cleans the rectangular ottoman by the sliding glass doors. It also cleans the modernist still life painting above the modernist fireplace, and then it cleans beneath a pair of armless lounge chairs. The wife herself is rendered as racially white, wearing a pink dress, and her multiple cleaning ghosts are utter whiteness, blank forms populating the illustrated room. In an ad for Glow Coat floor polish from 1956, the white housewife is again in a pink dress. And she's perched on this very simple ottoman above a glimmering sea of polished floor tiles. And her modernist sofa is a rectilinear island at the edge of the image. In an ad for Bissell rug shampoo from 58, the white housewife, this time wearing blue, stands carefully in the newly cleaned path on her rug, framed from the back by a modernist gridded window and a sideboard and a sculpted wooden armchair in the foreground. And then the cork tone housewife touches one toe gingerly to her new immaculate floor as she lounges in her distant modernist built-in window seat. In all four of these ads, we're seeing dynamics of exposure and defense against outside forces. The GE housewife scurries around the room, protecting it from contaminants at all vantage points. The glow coat wife is exceedingly vulnerable, like her floor. With her back to the plate glass window, she will be unable to see any intruder, nor will she be able to move from her task arranging, yes, an admittedly bizarrely large vase of flowers, because any footprint that she makes will mar the floor's reflective surface. The Bissell wife balances carefully in her path of cleanliness, surrounded by a presumably dirty rug, and is practically cornered by her modernist sideboard. The object will not be revealed until the rug is clean and she moves out from in front of it. The cork tone woman seems terrified, quite frankly, to walk on her floor, but she's also cornered against the unknown outside her curtained window. So these ads suggest that modernism sets really high standards for cleanliness to which the housewife must submit. These white women must protect their modernist homes from dirt, as the two on the left are doing. But more than that, these modernist homes and women must be protected from dirt, as well as from outsiders, as the two ads on the right dramatize. Modernism in advertisements like these, and it's not just these four. I mean, there's many, many, many. You read these, you see these over and over and over again, flipping through the pages of the magazine over this decade. Across many pages and weeks and months and years, modernism becomes a signifier of exclusion, of defensive vigilance against anything and anyone who comes from beyond the plate glass windowed boundaries of the lily white suburbs. Now, as I was working with this material, there were a few questions I regularly asked myself. One is, how do we understand whiteness? Like, what is racialized whiteness? And something I came back to time and again is that there's a sort of a way of thinking about it in terms of what it is and what it is not. So a positive definition and a negative definition. So what is whiteness positively? It could be the presence of white models. So here we're seeing whiteness equated with modernism because we only see white protagonists in these ads and promotional photographs. But racial whiteness is really only ever defined in opposition to something else. That is defined negatively. There is no white race without a black race or a brown races. And to the extent that these ads are all about control and keeping something at bay, keeping something out, keeping an other out, this is where I really began to think about this idea that modernism in these images seems invested in racial whiteness, in power. But there was another question that I wanted to ask myself. This is not the end of the story. Modernism may signify whiteness here in this context in Life magazine. Life magazine had a huge audience. It had readers of color, but its largest audience was white. And the editorial staff and advertisers operated from a place of kind of assuming that whiteness was the standard. But this was not the only media landscape in the post-war period. So John H. Johnson began publishing Ebony magazine in 1945, and by the 1950s, it had the largest African-American readership in the country. The Johnson Publishing Company claimed in 1959 that, quote, an amazing 79% of African-American households read the magazine. So notably in Ebony, modern design functions in a different way. Important historians like Adam Green from here in Chicago and Brenno Wynn Greer, who's based at Wellesley College, they've argued that Ebony emulated Life magazine, that it copied sort of its journalistic format and its commercial success. But that does not necessarily translate into a lifestyle magazine that copied Life's whiteness. Mid-Century Ebony is a really complex archival source, but it's not about copying whiteness. And there are a few things that stand out. So the first thing to note, and this is a poor photograph intentionally, the first thing to note is that modern design hardly ever appears in advertisements for cleaning supplies that feature Black protagonists. I found one ad. I looked through every page of Ebony from November 1949 to November 1959, and I found one ad, and it was this one that included a Black model, modern design, and cleaning supplies. So I was looking for those three things. I was looking for cleaning supplies, a Black protagonist, and modern design, and I only found one. And I just sort of took this in passing because I was like, okay, that's one. I'm sure there'll be more, and then I'll go back and get a better photo. And then I discovered that no, there were no other. This was the only one, and I just never went back and got a better photo of it. So anyway, so that was the full page, and that's just me trying to crop and pixelate. It gets pixelated, but there's this. That is the woman standing in front of what looks like a modernist dresser. But that's literally the only example I found of modernism and cleanliness in Ebony in this decade. It's not that there are not cleaning supplies advertised in Ebony. There are plenty of cleaning supplies. It's just that modernism is not used in those ads. That's the difference. Cleaning supplies in both, but modernism is everywhere in life with cleaning supplies and nowhere in Ebony. So it's modernism's not getting connected to these sort of tropes of control or exclusion. Instead, modernism appears much more commonly as a prop in advertisements selling a vision of Black social confidence. And so here I'm going to walk you through these 4 ads like I did with the Life ads. So first, we have a couple in what you're encouraged to assume is their modern home in an ad for the Chicago Metropolitan Mutual Assurance Company. And the ad copy celebrates, quote, simple, functional, and beautiful furniture that can be, quote unquote, admired and cherished. And note how this photograph forges a connection between the couple and their dramatic modern sofa. The husband sprawls on the couch and his jacket almost blends in with the upholstery, while the wife's left leg doubles with the sofa's back leg, so it looks like she's almost like part of the sofa. We're catching them in perhaps a private moment of what the ad calls that wonderful pride of ownership, quote unquote. And she seems about to walk around to the sofa and invite us in. Modernism also appears in advertisements for Lord Calvert whiskey. And Lord Calvert whiskey ran an ad campaign in both Life and Ebony in the early 50s around the tagline, Men of Distinction. So you're seeing Men of Distinction and then Men of Distinction. You might be thinking, oh, but those aren't ads. Those look like an article or something, because they do almost look like an article. They look like editorial content, but across the bottom it says blended whiskey. Like these are clearly advertisements. They just look like editorial content. And especially when you compare them to the Life ad, which looks more like an ad. Anyway, in both of these Ebony ads, it features Black men who were highly successful in the arts. So Hilliard Robinson was an architect, and George Olden was a graphic designer and art director at CBS. And there are these wonderful smaller pictures of them at home, entertaining, being hosts. And they have distinctive evidence of modernism. So Olden here on the right is reclining in a Saarinen womb chair, and his guest is sitting in a webbed side chair designed by Jens Rissam. Robinson on the left has 2 guests as he leans on his large television. Both of his guests are sitting in some version of a webbed chair. The curvy arms, that has eluded me for 6 or 7 years. I still can't figure out who the designer is, but anyway. And an amoeba-shaped blonde wood table between them. The distinctive qualities in images like these is that the protagonists of the ads are comfortable with their furniture. physically and socially. They're not cleaning them, they're not defending against outsiders or the unknown. This furniture is a prop of social ease, of bodily comfort, and of financial security. Sure, we may be seeing some of these figures from the back, as if we are approaching or intruding on a closed party, but someone is always facing us. And in fact, it's the gracious host, as if they might invite us in. Modernism here is not about exclusion so much as confident social gathering. And so here is one of my favorite ads from this decade. So look at this closely. So first of all, she's sitting in a butterfly chair with her beer and glass and purse on yet another biomorphic coffee table. She holds a copy of Ebony, because we know it's Ebony because here's the masthead is right there. It's folded back to the ad that she is in. And that ad, of course, contains her holding a magazine with the image. It goes on and on and on, sort of down all the way to the sort of the tiniest printer's dot. With their settings silhouetted out, these two could be anywhere, their own home, a friend's home. But as they look at the reader and hold up the magazine, they seem to be forging a specific community. They create a circle of engagement between us, who are holding an Ebony, and themselves holding a copy of Ebony. And the implied code is a social code of like-minded African Americans gathering together across a magazine and a biomorphic modern table. So ultimately, I argue, and I'm winding down here, that there is more emphasis on control and cleanliness and defensive exclusion in Life's modernism, which we're seeing on the left half. And in contrast, there's more emphasis on bodily comfort and economic agency in Ebony's modernism, which you're seeing on the right. What's the larger impact of this finding? I want to propose that mid-century modernism was diverse. The history that has been prioritized is one of whiteness, but mid-century modernism was not always about whiteness. Instead, modern in the mid-century is a multi-stranded, highly varied history, and modernism played a role in many different communities. So the exhibit here at the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, here's the great images from it. You can go see on your own. It allows you to go deep into your own history. And by virtue of that narrow scope, you can really begin to see the complexity and messiness and variety of mid-century modernism here in your own backyards.
Why do you think that the white women are all dressed up and they're vacuuming and they're alone in the end? There is no social interaction.
Right.
What's the appeal of that in Life? I mean, Life magazine.
I think it's about immaculateness. I mean, what's the appeal? I don't know. I think the appeal is like something about control. It's about aesthetic control. And it's about control of your space and your environment. That's the interpretation that I come up with. And that the women are presented as perfectly as their homes. So there is this also a doubling. I mean, it's a great question. I think, there's a doubling between the women as object and the house as object or their interior. It's all they are just all sort of the same thing. They're all things.
But even the ad, this is man versus woman, but
yeah,
the white ad for Lord Calvert.
Yeah,
that is so off-putting.
Yes,
I mean, it is. I mean, look at this guy.
Yeah, he's an architect. That's why I chose it because
what? Well,
the reason in my book, I went into this a little bit more because he's an architect and Hilliard Robinson is an architect. So it's sort of interesting to compare how two architects are actually, but he's alone. And what is prioritized in the Ebony ads, it's all about social community and about interactions and about affirming one's place in a community rather than sort of view the monolith like your skyscraper.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I didn't see you present. Did you not find any ads with just a single black woman? I mean, you got all these ads with single white women.
Yeah.
And then like the ebony ads tend to be about community, but they're mostly men.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know, I off the top of my mind, I don't, okay, so two answers. In the advertising in Ebony, no, off the top of my head, I don't recall seeing women alone. They're always in a couple, like there's a whole great spread of like Coca-Cola ads, but they're always in a couple. So there's a lot of couples or groups of women in the ads. However, you do see in Ebony, there is a similar photographic trope of women and chairs that you see in some of the editorial content, and that appears in the fashion pages of Ebony. So this talk was already too long, so I didn't like get into that, but in my book, I talk about that because that's one of the ways where Ebony is doing some things that are kind of similar to life, putting women in modern chairs and emphasizing all of the curves, the silhouettes. And at the same time, the women in Ebony are often doing something a little different. Did I include this one of Dorothy Dandridge? No, I took it out. Where she's, no, those are my leftover slides. Anyway, there are a couple where the women are basically like that dismantled butterfly chair is a prop that they use over and over again, and they're just like walking through the chair, and it's really fascinating. So they're doing something a little different, but it is still, yes, a single woman. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, and actually it wasn't single women, but there was a single soul white man too that it just seems like it's kind of sad actually. The white people, it just seems like so lonely.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah. So this is the visual culture that I found when I was looking. I mean, I don't know, you go into look, and then this is the stuff you find.
But I was gonna ask, like advertisers, so it's the same product, but they're advertising to, like, do we know the advertisers? Why there's
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually in my book, I have more examples of companies that are advertising in both magazines, and sometimes they're doing things that are different for the two magazines, just like aesthetically different. And sometimes it's aesthetically different. Sometimes like Miller Beer did a series of ads that were drawings, and the drawings are in color in Life magazine with white figures, and then they reproduce them in black and white in Ebony, and they black-faced the figures. Ebony was also only publishing in black and white at that time, but still, like there are changes made to the figures to make them look slightly more phenotypically black, but they're very complicated, I think, comparisons. Anyway, one of the things I would say is that what you're pointing out is the advertising arm behind the advertising industry that was working with Ebony is a really important piece of this that we sort of I only know in part, and there are historians who have done a lot of research on the growth of a marketing industry, specifically around Black professionals becoming marketing agents, marketers, sort of working for PR and advertising companies in the 1950s, and presenting themselves as, we can be the white company's connection to the Black community. We can help you figure out what would be the right kind of ad to put in a major media vehicle like Ebony. And so there's John H. Johnson was part of actually helping to make that happen. So it's a very interesting sort of ecosystem of advertising.
The black hands look kind of like, and Ebony, that's what Ebony did, right? Ebony was the only magazine at one period. Right?
Yeah, I mean, Jet was still publishing, but Jet is a very different, it's small and it's, yeah.
But this is like educating, educating the people who bought the magazine about the successful African Americans.
Yeah.
Whereas the white ad, there's no need to educate.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And that's why I pointed out that it kind of looks like editorial content. It's interesting how when I first came across it, I was like, oh, is this an article about Hilliard Robinson? And then I was like, oh no, this is an ad with Hilliard Robinson, but it's explaining, his success as a professional. So
it's kind of ironic in a way, because the culture of the period was about informality and entertainment.
Yeah.
In general.
And you see relatively little of that in life, like in the actual photos of people living in their modern furniture, very little informality.
So this is a mid-century modern. The modern design was taking hold of art, architecture, everything. Wouldn't that have been common for advertisers to embrace something like that as part of their advertising and all kind of things? And is there a lot more complexity to the integration of this modern designs and everything beyond advertisers are looking to put in front of people things that are going to be attractive, new. And is there a lot more complexity to the fact that advertisers are making decisions to embrace vehicles? Well, women without clothes on is still the most popular seller. So I'm not saying that they're necessarily doing drastic things, and the fact that there's modern design things in there that are put forward by advertising people. So
well, I guess what I'm not. So I think that's a really important point. And I think what I'd say, a couple of things is, what I'm not showing you are all of the ads that have period revival furniture in them, of which there are plenty in both Ebony and in Life. So, I was, specifically so my project was, how does modern design appear? Like, where do we see it? And there are times when I felt like I was going through these magazines, and what I was actually doing was always looking at the corners of each photo, because you don't often see the entire object because the object is like a prop, but it's way in the corner, So anyway, so that's what I was interested in. And so I'm just not showing you like this other side of it. And believe me, period revival stuff is very popular still across that landscape in the 1950s. Yes. I mean, but all you have to do is go watch Leave It to Beaver or something. Any of like the sort of stereotypical white suburban TV shows, all had colonial revival sets. So, that was the furnishing for it. So anyway, so I would say that that's one of the things I'm interested in, or was interested in, is like the signification of the furniture. Like, how is it functioning to tell some kind of extra message to the story? But the larger question of like the aesthetic design of the ads, there's no doubt that over the course of the decade for both Life and Ebony, towards the later 50s, both of those magazines become bolder, with more photos, like even in their editorial pages, that are just very spare and minimalist. And there is an idea that modernism is infiltrating a whole way of looking. But that's a different question than my question. Like, my question was really just about the furniture and what does it signify?
Fascinating.